Hey, you. Welcome to RJ Debate. Today we're going to chat about something pretty deep, actually. This huge clash between, what ancient traditions might say about who you are, your identity, and what your DNA is actually revealing about, well, where you really came from.
Yeah, it's a massive tension, isn't it? Because, for literally thousands of years, group identity has been built on these incredibly powerful stories, narratives of exclusive biological lines, sometimes called silsila, or this whole idea of being a chosen people. It's foundational for so many cultures.
Exactly. Foundational. And then, bam, modern population genetics kind of walks onto the scene. And it gives us this cold, hard statistical map of human mixing, what the scientists call admixture. Basically, it shows everyone's mixed. So, the central question we really got to wrestle with today is this. Does this genetic data, this hard science, does it just blow up those foundational claims of religiously chosen identities? Show them up as, I don't know, historical fiction? Or does it maybe just force us to admit that those claims were actually always about something else, like a moral duty, a mission, not simple biology?
Hmm, I see why you lean towards the moral side, the ideal. But I'm kind of coming at this from, well, what feels like an empirical necessity. My argument is that historically, and definitely politically, a lot of communities have taken this chosenness idea literally, very literally, and genetics becomes essential, actually, because it's the tool, the empirical check that can expose and maybe even dismantle that politically dangerous myth of biological purity before it does more harm.
And I'd argue, maybe predictably, that the core idea of chosenness, when you really look at it theologically, is fundamentally a moral call, a normative one. It's about a mission or maybe a duty given by the divine, which, in the grand scheme of its actual spiritual meaning, makes that cold genetic data, well, largely irrelevant to the real purpose.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit, that high-minded claim about moral duty. Because the way it plays out in the real world, it doesn't always match that ideal, does it?
Well, my core position is that chosenness is supposed to be a heavy thing, a burden or a specific job, a vocation. It's absolutely not an entitlement, not some fixed biological status you just inherit through blood. And honestly, the most sophisticated versions of religious thinking, they've always understood this. You can see it super clearly in Islamic tradition, for example. The concept of khaira umma, right, the best community. It's explicitly conditional. It's not a label you get at birth. It's tied directly to the ongoing active moral duty of amar maruf nahi munkar, encouraging good and forbidding evil. If you stop doing the duty, you lose the status. Simple as that.
That's true theologically. Yeah, it pivots completely on action, not just who your parents were. But I guess I have to challenge how useful that theological ideal really is when you face political reality. Theologians might spell out that ethical call, sure, but the literal interpretation of chosenness, man, that's been weaponized historically with massive destructive results. Just think about border wars, territorial disputes that hang on claims of being the original people, or having some kind of pure settlement history. If you claim your identity and your land rights rest on pure blood or an unbroken line back to ancient ancestors, well, genetics becomes the necessary empirical check on that claim.
Okay, so let's look at that empirical check then. What's the genetic consensus actually saying?
Well, the most consistent thing coming out of population genetics, again and again, is just universal, radical admixture. Everybody is mixed, all of us. Look at genetic studies in places like Indonesia. The science shows it's incredibly tough to even define who the most original Indonesian is. Why? Because pretty much everyone is demonstrably a mix of at least 4 major historical migrations. It's like the biological opposite of any claim to a pure exclusive lineage. So if someone's building a political identity based on purity, genetics basically proves they're building their house on, quicksand. And that sand is constantly shifting underneath them.
Right, which brings us smack into this conceptual problem, doesn't it, where science and religion bump heads. Some philosophers call it the literalism trap. There's that famous idea, Stephen Jay Gould talked about it a lot, called NOMA, non-overlapping magisteria. The idea is that science and religion should just, stay neatly in their own lanes. Science deals with facts, religion deals with meaning and values.
Yeah, I know, NOMA, but it totally crashes and burns in this debate, doesn't it?
Because these literal religious claims, they explicitly cross over into the science lane. When a faith tradition says, we are the biological descendants of person X, and that makes us distinct, well, that's a scientific claim. It directly invites empirical proof or disproof. You can't really claim a biological truth and then yell NOMA and run away when the DNA test comes back with results you don't like.
I'm not entirely convinced by that framing because the science itself, especially when it touches identity, can be incredibly politicized. It gets unstable. The conflict isn't always just simple fact versus myth. It's often a really vicious contestation of authority. We kind of have to look at this through the lens of STS, right? Science and technology studies, which really highlights how non-scientific factors, so like who's funding the research or political pressure, can shape what even gets accepted as a scientific fact.
Okay, fair point about politics. Give me a concrete example where the political heat actually overruled the data itself.
Okay, think about that really controversial Arnaiz-Villena study. Back in 2001, that team found, using genetic markers, a really close kinship between modern Jewish populations and Palestinian populations, essentially linking both groups back to the ancient Canaanites who lived there thousands of years ago. Their conclusion was basically shared ancestry and continuity, not one group replacing another.
And that paper got retracted, didn't it?
It did, pulled completely, but, and this is the crucial part, it was retracted not because the core HLA marker data was shown to be bad science. It was retracted because the author's political language, the way they framed that shared identity and its implications, was deemed totally unacceptable by the journal's sponsors and, well, the wider political establishment. That kind of proves that the truth or stability of a scientific finding can sometimes depend entirely on the political weather and whose authority is paying the bills.
Okay, I absolutely acknowledge the political language in that paper was explosive. And yeah, that led to the retraction. But, and this is my crucial part, the key empirical finding, the finding that both groups share a massive, common genetic heritage rooted in the ancient populations of the Levant, that finding remains robust. It's been confirmed again and again in multiple, subsequent, very carefully done ancient DNA studies. The science actually confirms that the modern identity labels, Jewish or Palestinian, are incredibly powerful cultural and religious categories, absolutely. But they are layered onto what is largely a shared biological foundation. So the genetic data, despite the political drama around that one study, ultimately pushes us towards a politically, revolutionary conclusion. Massive human continuity and mixing across these supposedly rigid identity lines, not pure clean replacement narratives.
Okay, I see why you emphasize genetics as this kind of solvent, just breaking down old stories. But let me offer a slightly different angle. Sometimes genetic patterns actually seem to validate the power of social commitment, of cultural continuity. They aren't always just about random mixing. Sometimes they reflect the stability of a social rule held over a very long time.
You mean the Jewish priesthood example?
Exactly that. The Kohanim, the Jewish priestly line, they have this tradition, a claim of direct patrilineal lineage stretching all the way back to Aaron, Moses' brother. Now that's a social and religious rule about who gets to perform certain duties. And guess what? Genetic studies found this thing called the Cohen modal haplotype. It's a specific Y DNA marker, technically J58. It's found significantly more often among Kohanim men worldwide compared to other Jewish men and the general population. And this marker points back to a likely shared male ancestor roughly in the biblical era, maybe 3,190 years ago, give or take. Now, obviously, this doesn't prove divine intervention or anything, but it is a fascinating example of what some researchers call a genetic artifact created by social practice, specifically the centuries-long strict practice of endogamy, marrying within the group to maintain that priestly line. The social rule, the commitment, literally created the distinct genetic pattern we see today. It shows that commitment, social rules, they matter biologically over time.
That is a compelling argument for the power of human social rules shaping biology. But have you considered the incredibly dark, frankly brutal, flip side of that exact same mechanism?
Go for it. Lay it out.
Okay, look at the South Asian caste system. There are major genetic studies
some out of Harvard, showing that for thousands of years, there was widespread natural genetic mixing across the Indian subcontinent. And then suddenly, it just stops, brutally, about 2,000 years ago. This sudden halt in gene flow, this massive genetic bottlenecking within specific groups, it coincides almost perfectly with the time that strict legal enforcement of endogamy, marrying only within your caste, was being mandated by powerful legal texts like the Dharmashastra. So in the Cohen case you mentioned, endogamy was maybe about preserving a cultural or religious identity. Fine. But in the caste system case, the genetic data isn't just like celebrating cultural preservation. It's recording the brutal history of enforcement and social stratification. The DNA itself becomes a scar. It literally records the precise moment that social rules prevented mixing and were used to enforce a rigid, oppressive hierarchy. It's like the DNA is a silent witness to that history of oppression.
That evidence, wow, the idea of a genetic scar, that's incredibly powerful. And it brings us right back, doesn't it, to the central ethical danger in how we use this data today. We have to constantly remember and warn about the really dark history of determinism, this absolute conviction that biology is destiny, that your genes dictate exactly who you are and what you're capable of.
Yeah, that historical shadow is crucial because it feels like we're kind of repeating the same old mistakes just with fancier tech now.
We are. Eugenics, it relied on deeply flawed, biased science, and it led to horrifying outcomes, like 60,000 forced sterilizations right here in the US. That was pure institutionalized scientific racism. And my worry is if we keep prioritizing genetics, keep pushing it as the primary way to define human identity, we risk creating this sort of pop biological determinism. You see it already, right? People using those direct-to-consumer DNA tests, Ancestry, 23andMe, whatever, and instead of embracing the message of universal mixing that the science actually shows, they latch onto it to reinforce rigid ideas about race. They're looking for a purity score, even when the science itself tells them purity is a myth.
And the danger just skyrockets when it's not just individuals, but the state that grabs hold of that DNA data and starts misusing it. That's what I think of as like the mismeasure of man for the 21st century, using science to justify social biases.
Tell me more about that state misuse, because that feels like a really serious category error happening there.
Oh, it absolutely is. There was this case, for example, where the Canadian Border Services Agency actually used a commercial DNA ancestry test. They tried to use its results to deny a migrant's nationality claim. They were essentially treating a statistical genetic marker, which is just a probability percentage, right, as if it were hard proof of a legal and social identity, which it fundamentally is not.
That is the exact categorical error. Nationality, citizenship, ethnicity. These are socially constructed categories. They're legal categories. They are not simple DNA percentages that determine where you belong or who you are legally. You cannot look at someone's admixture pie chart from one of those tests and logically or legally conclude their citizenship status. It's absurd.
Exactly. It's using a really sophisticated scientific tool to make the same old tired deterministic mistake, reducing a complex lived human identity down to a single biological number. And then the state uses that number for potentially exclusionary purposes. Genetics should be used to dismantle essentialism, to show we're all connected and mixed, not to rebuild essentialism with, shinier, more scientific-looking bricks.
I think this whole debate, it kind of leads us to the same fundamental ethical place in the end, even though we got here from, pretty different starting points, theology versus empiricism. Since the genetics seems to comprehensively show that biological purity is, well, a fiction, and that mixing is the human story, then theology, I think, is ultimately forced to embrace its highest definition of chosenness. The only really viable definition left standing is that it's a universal moral responsibility, right? A task, a duty, to uphold justice and serve humanity. It has to move the core of identity away from passive inherited biology towards active, universal ethics. That's the only way it makes sense anymore.
Yeah, my analysis definitely centers on the empirical side, the need for that scientific check. But I completely agree with your ethical conclusion there. Genetics, fundamentally, forces intellectual honesty. It acts as that crucial empirical corrective, challenging the fundamentalist, the literal readings of identity narratives that have, historically, fueled so much exclusion and conflict. So the dialogue today wasn't really about one side winning. It's about making sure that when we talk about who we are, we're being honest about our actual mixed history, and that we're deeply, deeply responsible about how science could be misused, again, for exclusion and political games.
That's an extremely important distinction to hold on to. Honesty and responsibility.
Whether chosen identities are dissolved by DNA or maybe redefined by ethics. Definitely left you with something to chew on, I hope. Thanks for tuning in to RJ Debate. If you liked this episode, hit like, subscribe to RJ Auto, and maybe share it with your friends.